In 2018, a group of friends decided to spend a weekend camping in a dense forest on the border of Oregon. Jack, Michael, Sarah, and Emma were adventure enthusiasts who had heard about this untouched forest, rumored to have been undisturbed for years. But they had no idea about the nightmare awaiting them. On the first night, everything seemed normal. They lit a campfire, shared stories, and laughed, but it was just the beginning of something sinister. Shortly after midnight, they heard strange whispers coming from deep within the forest, whispers that sounded almost human but disturbingly unnatural. They tried to dismiss it as their imagination, but Michael insisted on investigating the source of the sound. Michael took a flashlight and ventured into the thick trees. Suddenly, his voice went silent. Minutes later, they heard fast footsteps rushing toward the camp. Frozen in place, they watched as Michael emerged from the darkness, but something was off. His body trembled, his eyes were vacant, and he seemed like he had witnessed something beyond comprehension. When they asked him what happened, he didn't say a word. He just sat there, staring into the fire, mumbling incoherently. The next morning, Michael remained silent. Emma decided to record some videos on her phone to document their trip. But when she reviewed the footage, she noticed something horrifying. In one of the clips, a tall, shadowy figure stood behind Michael as he returned to camp. None of them had an explanation for what they saw, but they knew they had to leave immediately. As they packed up, they discovered that someone, or something, had cut the ropes of their tents, as if trying to keep them there. Then, the whispers returned, closer this time, surrounding them. Without hesitation, they ran towards their car, but the path they came from had mysteriously vanished, as if the forest had changed its shape. As the sun began to set, they felt an overwhelming sense of being watched. A blood-curdling scream echoed from behind them, and when they turned around, Emma was gone. No trace of her remained, as if she had vanished into thin air. Panic took over, and they ran blindly until they stumbled upon an old wooden cabin hidden among the trees. Entering the cabin was a reckless decision, but they had no other choice. Inside, they found the walls covered in bizarre carvings and names etched into the wood, names of previous victims. One name stood out: Emma, freshly carved. Their blood ran cold. When they turned around, they saw something they would never forget. A tall, grotesque entity stood in the corner of the room, watching them silently. Its features were ever shifting, as if its face was never fully formed. It began to move toward them slowly, but before it could reach them, Michael let out a desperate scream and threw an old lantern at it, setting the room on fire. They bolted out of the cabin, ignoring the shrieks that filled the night. They didn't stop running until they found a road leading to a nearby village, where they were eventually rescued by locals. But when the authorities questioned them about Emma, there was no sign of her, almost as if she had never existed. Weeks later, Jack received an email from Emma's account. It contained no text, only a single image, a photo of their campsite from that night. In the background, the same shadowy figure stood there, watching them from the start. Was the forest haunted by malevolent spirits? Or was something ancient lurking in the shadows, waiting for new victims? No one knows for sure, but one thing is certain: those who enter the depths of the forest never return the same. The Cursed Cabin. In the summer of 1996, 5 college friends, Daniel, Lisa, Mark, Rachel, and Tony, decided to take a road trip into the Appalachian Mountains. They had heard about an old abandoned cabin hidden deep within the forest, a place known among locals as the Hollow Shack. It was said to be cursed, but being young and reckless, they dismissed the warnings as superstition. Their adventure began like any other, camping under the stars, sharing stories around the fire, and enjoying the isolation from the world. But as night fell, an eerie stillness settled over the woods. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just silence. Then, the whispers began. Faint at first, The voices seemed to be carried by the wind, unintelligible but undeniably present. Lisa thought she heard someone calling her name. When she turned, there was nothing but darkness between the trees. By the second night, their unease grew. Strange symbols were carved into the trees around their campsite, symbols none of them had seen before. Mark, the skeptic of the group, suggested it was just a prank by other hikers. But Daniel felt differently. He had grown up hearing stories about places like this, places that should not be disturbed. Despite their fears, they continued their hike the next morning and finally reached the hollow shack. It stood as a rotting relic of a forgotten era, its wooden planks warped and its windows shattered. Against their better judgment, they entered. Inside, they found a room covered in old newspaper clippings, all detailing mysterious disappearances in the area. Some of the articles were decades old, yet fresh blood stained the edges of the pages. A trapdoor in the corner of the room caught Rachel's eye. Without thinking, she pulled it open. A deep black void stared back at them. A sickening stench rose from below, a mix of decay and something worse. Suddenly Lisa screamed. In the reflection of a broken mirror on the wall, she saw something behind them, something tall, thin, and featureless. Panic set in. They ran for the door, but it slammed shut on its own. The whispers returned, louder now, forming words. "You shouldn't have come." One by one, they were separated in the chaos. Daniel found himself in a narrow hallway that hadn't been there before. Tony's voice called for help, but when Daniel followed the sound, he found only a trail of blood leading into the darkness. Lisa, Mark, and Rachel huddled together in the main room, desperately trying to break down the door. Suddenly, a guttural voice spoke from the shadows. "You belong to us now." The next morning, the cabin was empty. Park rangers found their campsite abandoned, their tents slashed apart. The only trace of them was Lisa's camera, found half buried near the shack. The last photo showed all 5 of them standing in front of the cabin, but there was a 6th figure among them, its face a blurred void. The hollow shack remains abandoned to this day. Some say, on quiet nights, you can still hear the whispers of those who were lost inside. The night was dark, and the wind howled through the trees, whispering secrets only the forest could understand. 5 friends, Adam, Waleed, Sarah, Nada, and Ali, decided to spend their weekend camping in a remote area known as Shadow Valley, a place long abandoned due to the terrifying legends that surrounded it. They arrived late in the evening, setting up their tents near a still, glassy lake that reflected the pale light of the moon. Everything seemed normal at first, until the strange occurrences began. As they sat around the campfire, Nada decided to share a story she had heard about the forest. She lowered her voice and said, "They say a group of explorers vanished here 50 years ago. The locals believe their spirits still roam these woods, searching for new bodies to inhabit." Ali chuckled dismissively. "Just superstitions. There's nothing here but trees and shadows." But none of them knew that this night would be the last they would ever spend as normal human beings. The first signs. The fire crackled as an eerie silence settled over the group. A distant owl hooted, its call swallowed by the vast darkness of the valley. Suddenly, the flames flickered wildly, as if a gust of wind had rushed through, except no one had felt anything. "Did you see that?" Sarah whispered, her eyes darting around. "It's just the fire reacting to the wind," Adam replied, though his voice carried a hint of uncertainty. "Then why didn't we feel any wind?" Waleed countered. A heavy stillness settled, pressing against them like an invisible force. Then, from the depths of the forest, a low, guttural whisper echoed. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It sounded human. Ali stood up, grabbing a flashlight. "All right, who's messing with us?" He aimed the beam toward the trees, but all he saw were endless rows of towering trunks. Then, something moved. A shadow, tall, thin, and unnatural, lurched between the trees. It moved in an unsettling way, like a puppet with invisible strings. Sarah gasped. "Did you see that?" Before anyone could respond, a chilling laugh echoed from deep within the forest. It was distorted, unnatural, as if it came from multiple voices at once. The temperature around them plummeted, their breath turning into mist in the cold air. "We should leave," Nada said, her voice barely above a whisper. But as they turned toward their tents, they found them ripped apart. The fabric was slashed, poles bent at impossible angles, as if something had torn through them with inhuman strength. Then the whispering returned, closer this time. It came from everywhere and nowhere, all at once. "Run!" Adam choked out. And they did. Deeper into the woods, right into the darkness, right where it was waiting. They ran without direction, blinded by panic. The branches clawed at their clothes, roots tripped them, but the voices never stopped. "You shouldn't have come. Stay with us. We need more souls." The whispers weren't just around them. They were inside them, slithering into their ears like serpents. Ali tripped over a rock and tumbled to the ground, scraping his palms on the rough dirt. Walid skidded to a stop and reached down to help him, but Ali's face twisted in horror. "Behind you!" he screamed. Walid turned just in time to see a shadow stretch toward him, a long, impossibly thin arm reaching from the darkness. It had no features, no form, just an abyss in the shape of something almost human. The arm grabbed Walid's wrist, cold, unbearably cold. It felt like 1,000 needles stabbing into his skin at once. He tried to scream, but his voice was stolen, trapped in his throat. Sarah grabbed a fallen branch and swung it at the shadow. It passed right through, but the thing recoiled, as if reacting to her defiance. Ali yanked Walid free, and the group took off running again. But the forest was different now. The trees were no longer trees. They were watching. The bark twisted into grotesque faces, hollow eyes following their every move. And the path had disappeared. After what felt like hours of running, they stumbled upon something unexpected, an old wooden cabin half hidden by overgrown vines. "We have to go inside," Adam gasped, doubling over to catch his breath. "Are you insane?" Nada snapped. "That place looks worse than the forest." "It's shelter," Ali argued. "Whatever is out here, we can't outrun it forever." Reluctantly, they pushed the heavy wooden door open. The interior was damp, filled with the scent of rotting wood. A single lantern sat on a dust-covered table, flickering dimly as if waiting for them. The walls were covered in carvings, symbols, names, warnings. "Don't listen to them. They want your skin. If you see her, run." "See who?" Sarah murmured, tracing the words with trembling fingers. Then the door slammed shut behind them. A new sound joined the whispers. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the hallway leading deeper into the cabin. Adam grabbed the lantern and raised it, casting a weak glow ahead. Something moved. A figure, tall, covered in tattered, decayed clothing, stood at the end of the hall. Its head was tilted, as if it were listening. Then it took a step forward. Sarah screamed. The light flickered out, and the cabin was swallowed in darkness. The final choice. The next few moments were chaos. Adam fumbled for his phone, the screen flashing to life just long enough to see. It was closer. The figure was standing right in front of him. A skeletal hand reached out, fingers curling. The phone dropped to the floor. Total darkness. The whispers rose to a deafening level, their words merging into a single command: stay. Ali found the door handle and wrenched it open. Cold air rushed in, and with it, the light of the moon. The figure shrieked, recoiling into the shadows. They didn't hesitate. They ran. They ran until their legs gave out, until the first rays of sunlight pierced through the twisted canopy of trees. The whispers faded. The shadows melted into the morning light. They had escaped, but something was different. The road that led them into the forest was gone. The town they came from was missing, and in the distance, where the cabin should have been. The forest stretched endlessly, trapping them forever. Because in Shadow Valley, no one ever leaves. The drive took them 4 hours. 4 hours of winding roads, thickening trees, and the slow, creeping realization that they were heading somewhere truly isolated. By the time Daniel, Lisa, Mark, and Jenna arrived at the entrance to Black Hollow Forest, the sun was already beginning to dip beneath the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows between the trees. "This place is perfect," Mark said, stretching as he stepped out of the car. "No cell service, no people, just us and nature." "It's creepy," Lisa muttered, eyeing the towering trees that seemed to lean toward them. "Are you sure we should camp here? This place doesn't even show up on most maps." "That's the point," Daniel said, grinning. "We wanted a real adventure, didn't we?" With a bit of hesitation, Lisa helped unload the gear, and the four of them started their hike into the woods. The deeper they went, the quieter everything became. The usual forest sounds, chirping birds, rustling leaves, seemed to fade, replaced by an unsettling silence. It wasn't until they set up camp in a small clearing that things started to feel normal again. Mark lit the fire, and Jenna pulled out the marshmallows, the tension easing as they laughed and shared stories. The woods, though vast and dark, felt a little less intimidating with the warm glow of the fire flickering against the trees. But then, as the night deepened, things started to change. The first sign was subtle, a rustling sound just beyond the tree line. Too loud for a rabbit, too slow for a deer. "Did you hear that?" Lisa whispered. "Probably just the wind," Daniel said, though he glanced over his shoulder. Then came the second sign, a low, almost imperceptible whisper drifting through the trees. It wasn't the wind. It was something else. Something watching. "Okay, not funny," Mark said, standing up and shining his flashlight toward the sound. Nothing but trees. The whispering stopped. Jenna shivered. "Maybe we should just go to bed." They reluctantly agreed, each crawling into their respective tents. The fire burned low, crackling softly as the night stretched on. Then, in the dead of night, Lisa woke up. Something was outside her tent. At first, she thought it was one of the others, maybe getting up to use the bathroom. But as she listened, she realized whatever was out there wasn't moving like a person. It was circling. Slow, deliberate footsteps crunching on dried leaves. She held her breath. The steps stopped. Then, scratch, scratch, scratch. Something dragged its fingers or claws down the side of her tent. Lisa squeezed her eyes shut, heart hammering in her chest. "It's just your imagination. Just go back to sleep." The scratching stopped. Then a voice whispered, right against the fabric of her tent. "Let me in!" Lisa screamed. The camp exploded into chaos. Daniel and Mark stumbled out of their tents, flashlights cutting through the darkness. "Lisa? What happened?" Lisa burst out of her tent, eyes wide with terror. Something was outside my tent." They scanned the area, but there was nothing. Just the trees, silent and unmoving. "It was probably an animal," Mark said, though his voice wavered. "Let's just go back to sleep." Lisa didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning they found footprints. They weren't human. The tracks circled their campsite, deep impressions in the damp earth. Whatever had been there had walked on 2 legs, but the prints were elongated, the toes ending in sharp points. "What the hell?" Jenna whispered. "This has to be a prank," Daniel said, though his face had lost its usual bravado. Lisa wasn't convinced. "We need to leave. Now." Mark hesitated. "We came all this way." Then they heard it again, the whispering. Only this time it wasn't distant. It was coming from behind them. They turned as one, flashlights shaking in their hands. Between the trees, something stood watching, tall, impossibly thin, its skin as dark as the shadows around it. Its face, if it even had one, was obscured by the shifting darkness. but they could feel its eyes, watching, studying. Then it smiled. Lisa grabbed Jenna's arm. Run. And they did. The forest seemed endless. No matter how far they ran, the trees never thinned. The path they had taken to get here was gone, swallowed by the shifting woods. Behind them, the whispering followed, growing louder, closer. Then Jenna tripped. She hit the ground hard, gasping as she clutched her ankle. I can't run! Daniel skidded to a stop, turning back to help her. Mark and Lisa hesitated, eyes darting between the trees. We can't leave her! Daniel shouted. Then the whispering stopped. Silence. Too silent. A shadow fell over Jenna. She looked up. The thing was right there. A long, bony hand reached down. Jenna screamed as the darkness swallowed her whole. Mark pulled Lisa away. We have to go. Daniel was frozen. We can't just leave her. She's gone. And then, just like that, the whispering returned. But this time, it was Jenna's voice. Let me in. They ran. By the time they stumbled out of the forest, the sun was rising, golden light washing away the nightmare of the night before. They collapsed by the roadside, gasping for breath. Lisa turned back, half expecting to see the thing standing at the tree line. But there was nothing. Jenna was gone, and the forest was silent once more. No one spoke the entire drive back. They never found Black Hollow Forest on a map again, and at night, when the wind was just right, they could still hear Jenna whispering, "Let me in."